Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, and welcome to Then and Now. I'm your host, Ben Zdencanovic, and this episode is part of an occasional series of Then and Now that explores the past, present, and future of U.S. foreign policy and the U.S.-led international order. President Donald Trump has begun his second term in the White House with far-reaching implications for U.S. foreign policy and the role of the United States in the world. Here to discuss the foreign policy of the Trump administration is Dr. Stephen Wertheim, a senior fellow at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A historian of U.S. foreign policy, he is the author of Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, published by Harvard University Press in 2020. He writes on foreign policy and current events in publications such as The Atlantic, The Guardian, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. Stephen, welcome to Then and Now.
I'm glad to be on.
So we're less than a month now into the new Trump administration. Could you start off by taking us through Trump's stance on foreign policy so far on the campaign trail and in the transition? And how is it similar to or different from his foreign policy in the first administration?
Well, there's probably actually three things to compare here. There's Trump 1, there's the campaign, and then what we're getting so far in the early days of Trump 2. So in the first Trump administration, largely despite all the unusual rhetoric and sometimes tactics by President Trump, we essentially got a foreign policy that looked quite similar to the normal pattern. It was a foreign policy in which the United States continued to pursue global military primacy, to retain all of its alliances that have accreted over time. The United States ended up with the same adversaries and same allies at the end of Trump 1 as it did at the beginning. So, if you will, it was a kind of a primacy with less of a pretense to be doing good for the world. The liberal part of what some scholars call liberal hegemony took a hit, but the hegemony part didn't really at the end of Trump 1. So then we get to the campaign, the 2024 campaign. Trump said a lot about foreign policy and a little about foreign policy at the same time. He left himself a lot of room to maneuver. He basically wanted to criticize the Biden-Harris administration for the world being a mess, for the multiple ongoing wars in Europe and in the Middle East. And he said that he would end those wars very quickly, and he really said very little about how he would attempt to do those things. And then we've gotten something pretty surprising in the early days and weeks of the Trump 2 administration. In his inaugural address, Trump said very little about the kinds of issues that have dominated the U.S. foreign policy agenda for a long time, including in the campaign, issues overseas. It was very much centered on the Americas, the Western Hemisphere. And the only mention of China in Trump's inaugural address came in reference to the Panama Canal, when President Trump accused China of operating the canal, which is not true, and then vowed to take the canal back. So far, I think what we've seen are three distinctive things when it comes to foreign policy in the second Trump administration, distinctive both in the sweep of the history of U.S. foreign policy and distinctive even in comparison to Trump's first administration. First of all, as I mentioned, we've seen an America's first beginning in terms of action and rhetoric, one that's been avowedly imperial, with Trump claiming that he wants to acquire the Panama Canal, Greenland, and even Canada, and add it to the United States. Secondly, Trump has used tariffs seemingly so far for negotiation purposes rather than for economic purposes. But we did not see this in his first term. He announced the imposition of big tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, to a lesser degree from China, and then quickly suspended those tariffs for 30 days when he got some concessions from both countries, both Mexico and Canada, on the stated rationale for the tariffs, which was migration and drugs, fentanyl. Finally, what we've seen Trump do is bring the right-wing culture war to parts of the bureaucracy, the federal workforce, freezing foreign aid, the future of USAID, the agency that does most of U.S. development assistance abroad, is very much in limbo. At the Defense Department, the administration has taken steps to remove transgender service members and restore the so-called warrior ethos to the department, and there have been anti-DEI measures across the board. So far, it's been a kind of partial dismantling of the bureaucracy, not a complete one, though, so we may see more of that.
Well, let's go into a little bit more depth about one of these pillars of Trump's foreign policy in this term that you mentioned, which is this kind of naked sort of territorial expansionism in his rhetoric. You mentioned he has suggested that the U.S. take control of the Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada, making Canada the 51st state, as he puts it. So could you go a little bit more into depth about this rhetoric that is coming from Trump, and how does that compare with past forms of U.S. imperialism?
So Trump is explicitly bringing back a land hunger that dates from the beginning of the Republic and into the 19th century. In his inaugural address, he explicitly referenced manifest destiny, although when he did that, he referred to going to Mars. So it was the Monroe Doctrine plus Mars in the inaugural address. But, is it really appropriate to go back to that period and say that Trump is reverting to a well-known American tradition? I don't know, because as I mentioned, we've seen Trump make maximalist demands over tariffs so far and then back down. So he may be acting tactically. It is not clear whether he has a genuine intent to enlarge the territorial realm of the United States or not. And even beyond that, we might look differently at some of the targets that Trump has expressed interest in acquiring. Greenland might be the most serious target for Trump. It's something he mentioned in his first term and has returned to. And the United States has such significant access to Greenland as it is, and such leverage over the Danish government, which controls Greenland, that one wonders exactly what Trump is doing by claiming to want to acquire Greenland, if it is a mere negotiating tactic. The Panama Canal also, which Trump mentioned in his inaugural address, maybe it's a serious attempt. Ronald Reagan campaigned against Jimmy Carter on wanting to take back, or I should, at that time, not hand over the Panama Canal to Panama. Then again, they have been negotiating, representatives of the U.S. and Panama, for example, promising not to renew its membership in China's Belt and Road Initiative. So that's where we may end up in agreements like that, rather than in outright U.S. control of the Panama Canal. Canada, I have a very hard time imagining that Trump envisions an endgame in which the United States brings in Canada as the 51st, or I guess could be the 53rd state. So that seems to have begun as a joke that he's thrown into the mix of his actual diplomacy, quite counterproductively, because the reaction in Canada is not a positive one, shall we say. So, there's a lot to piece through, because even just on a tactical level, if Trump is bluffing or attempting to negotiate in a way that is in which his professed intentions do not represent his actual intentions, that is something quite different in U.S. foreign policy. And the historian in me, much as I tried, much as one might expect me to come loaded with precedents, really fails to find a good precedent for a president who would make routine bluffs like that.
And part of this unprecedented expansionist rhetoric that has developed recently from Trump is a proposal to seize control of Gaza and permanently displace the Palestinian population there, and to make it a U.S. territory, which many have compared to ethnic cleansing. So what do you make of this plan? How likely is this to come to fruition? And in what ways is this a break with past administrations' Middle East policy?
Well, it seems very unlikely to come to fruition, at least in the form that President Trump put forward in his press conference with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. If we take Trump's professed intention at face value, his idea is certainly something different from what past administrations, including his own, have aimed at. Envisioning ultimate U.S. ownership of the Gaza Strip. That's an idea I frankly never even heard discussed prior to Donald Trump as president of the United States announcing that he wanted to do that. So that is radically different. The displacement of the Palestinian population from Gaza that he appeared to envision, that is also different from prior U.S. policy. It's not been a declared objective of the United States to see Palestinians displaced from the Gaza Strip, though that had been a increasingly realistic possibility that is partially a result of U.S. policy, of U.S. support for Israel, as Israel has decimated the Gaza Strip over the past year plus. So the diminishing prospects for a Palestinian state certainly do have something to do with U.S. policy, but U.S. policy has remained, including under the Biden administration, that the ultimate outcome should be two states living side by side, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. At the same time, Trump may well be bluffing when he has put this idea of a Gaza made de novo into what he called the Riviera of the Middle East and owned by the United States of America. I find it very difficult to believe that a president who has campaigned many times against American nation building in the Middle East, would want to undertake a nation building project in Gaza, of all places. I do not think that that would resonate well even with Trump's MAGA faithful. In addition to which, gutting the U.S. agency that does international development would cause a problem in trying to develop the Gaza Strip, although perhaps he has another idea of how to get that done. In addition, regional governments have been very clear, as they were after Trump made his announcement, that it's a non-starter that they would take in large numbers of Palestinians if they even wish to go on an indefinite basis. So I do not think that Trump's idea, if it was thought through, my guess is that Trump is looking to distract and to manipulate the politics of the situation. Why might that be? Well, one of the things that Trump announced at the same time was that he is weighing an announcement on the West Bank, and that may be to allow Israel to annex parts of the West Bank. That news was buried, however, under the torrent of coverage about Trump's wild idea to depopulate Gaza and reconstruct it and repopulate it. So already it served a certain function of distraction. And if what we get is an announcement that Trump has backed off his Gaza plan, but is endorsing Israeli annexation in the West Bank, some people may say, well, at least the very worst outcome had been averted. In addition, there are signs from other officials in the Trump administration that they are looking to see regional governments, Arab governments, step up to figure out how to provide support for Gaza in a post-conflict context. And Trump's wild idea could allow those governments to say, we have saved the Palestinian population of Gaza and give them a certain amount of cover for doing that. It could also be cover for an eventual Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement, since it seems unlikely that one of the longstanding conditions that Saudi Arabia has put forward for such an agreement, namely serious steps by Israel toward the creation of a Palestinian state, will be fulfilled. So I cannot tell you which of these, if any of them, is the true intention of the U.S. president, but the fact that we're having a kind of speculative conversation like this is itself quite significant.
So let's switch tracks to Europe now. So I think one of the commonalities between Trump's first term and his second term is really questioning the value of NATO. And Trump has been questioning the degree to which the United States is supporting Western European defense spending and pressing European governments to increase their defense budgets to as much as 5% of spending. So, given the ongoing war in Ukraine, what do you think a second Trump term means for the NATO relationship?
It's a very good question, and one to which we haven't gotten many signals in terms of an answer amidst all the flurry of Trump's activities so far in his second term. What we've seen, as you mentioned, is the request that NATO allies spend 5% of their GDP on their militaries, which is a very large number, a number that the United States itself does not meet. So again, is that a request with an intention to see it fulfilled or the beginning of a negotiation? probably the latter. With respect to the war in Ukraine, President Trump ran on bringing about a rapid end to the conflict, and it remains very unclear what the thinking is internally about how to do that. What has been the clearest idea of his team is that the United States should put pressure on both sides, both Ukraine and Russia, to come to the negotiating table, and perhaps if an agreement is forged and one or both parties are not signing, that they could use threats to bring those parties to an agreement. But beyond that, we haven't learned very much so far, and there may not be a clear idea internally of what they expect a realistic endgame for the war might be. What we have seen is the special envoy for the war in Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, make a little bit more room for himself. He said it will take longer, certainly than the 24 hours President Trump promised on the campaign trail to try to bring about an end to the conflict. And I expect that, the reality is dawning that we really don't know exactly what Vladimir Putin would accept. There's also uncertainty about how Ukraine would react to certain kinds of scenarios. And so it's going to be very difficult to bring this conflict to an end through a negotiated settlement. And to go back to his first term, the closest thing to a precedent was Trump's diplomacy with North Korea. He held a number of summits with the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and I thought that was a constructive move in and of itself. But the problem was that it was not accompanied by the kind of diplomatic spadework that was realistic and needed to be able to bring about an agreement. And so in the end, it came to very little, and the North Koreans walked away and distrusted the United States even more than they did coming in, which is part of how we get to the North Koreans aligning with Russia over the past several years. Now, there's a second part of your question that goes beyond Ukraine to the U.S. role in European security more broadly. And again, we really don't know what we'll get. I think we should think in terms of maybe roughly three scenarios. So in Trump 1.0, the main focus of policy was burden sharing. In other words, the United States remained the leader of European security through NATO. Trump, despite making noises on the campaign trail in other directions, did not get far in trying to back away from membership in NATO or back away from the Article 5 collective security guarantee enshrined in the North Atlantic Treaty. But what he did do was press the Europeans to spend more on defense. And this time, I think we'll put a lot of pressure on them on the trade front. And like last time, pressure them with respect to European relations with China. So that's one very plausible scenario. We could get, burden sharing only more so as we did from Trump 1.0. The second scenario, though, would be more like burden sharing or we're out. On the campaign trail, Trump drew a lot of headlines by suggesting that if Russia invaded a NATO country that was not, quote unquote, paying its dues, by which I think he means the guideline of 2% of GDP on defense spending, he would tell Russia to do whatever it wanted. So let's translate that into he would not defend a country that was not spending enough on defense. So he could, in effect, formalize that policy by making the U.S. defense commitment through NATO conditional on the level of military spending or perhaps even other factors of a NATO ally. And you might think that might require Trump to withdraw from NATO. Not necessarily, because Article 5 does not explicitly commit the United States to use military force against an aggressor. And so one could reinterpret Article 5 to entail, something much more minimal in the event of a conflict. So that's another scenario. That scenario would not seem to change much strategically for the United States, however, because the countries that spend the most of their economies on defense are precisely the countries that are closest to Russia and most threatened by Russia. So what would happen is that the United States would no longer be on the hook for defending Spain against nobody, but would remain on the hook for defending the Baltic states, for example, and Poland against Russia. It's not necessarily a major shift in U.S. foreign policy, but that brings us to something that could be a major shift. The third option would be not burden sharing, but burden shifting. Under this scenario, the United States would start pulling back conventional military forces and assets from Europe. It would start signaling a reduction in its commitment to European security that would not be made, conditional on levels of defense spending or trade relationships or anything else. And the idea would be to get Europe to at least begin a process of becoming less dependent or even independent of the United States when it comes to European defense. In other words, being capable and responsible of handling a military conflict against NATO or EU members, even if the United States were to prove unable or unwilling to contribute to that response. It is possible we could get in that direction. It does require the United States to get behind the growth of Europe's own defense industrial base in order to create the political economy that will support higher levels of defense spending in Europe. That's something that the United States has been reluctant to do. It's done the opposite. It wants to sell American arms because that's a win for American arms makers. And Trump very much sees arms deals in these ways. So he would have to shift gears on that front. And he'd have to be willing to make a determined effort to pull the United States back to a degree from European security. Maybe not so much that it alarms the Europeans so much that they start freaking out and potentially cutting bilateral deals with Russia, but enough that they get the point that they need to take responsibility for defending their own continent.
And finally, let's move to China, which Trump frames as the greatest geopolitical rival of the United States. In recent years, we've seen tensions over Taiwan, the U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, and U.S. trade policy on semiconductors and artificial intelligence. So how do you see Trump's second term as shaping competition with China? And what do you see in terms of the risk of military conflict at this point?
Well, that too is something of an open question. I think contingency may be the theme of our discussion today. And the fact that it's not so clear what the contours of Trump 2's China policy will be is alone significant and something of a surprise if we were to go back, at least a couple years ago. The first Trump administration led the American political system to reevaluate China, to treat the PRC as the number one threat and rival to the United States. By the end of his administration, Donald Trump was on track to becoming, if you will, the Harry Truman of the new Cold War between the United States and China. And indeed, the Biden administration also took a sharply competitive approach to relations with Beijing that cemented or seemed to cement the U.S.-China competition as a bipartisan affair. But Trump himself was perhaps never quite as sold on the intense security competition with China as his own staff, as the U.S. national security community was. He certainly has and had and has big grievances with China over trade, but seems more flexible when it comes to geopolitical and military matters. And now, in the past few years, he has changed his own position on China, including most overtly on the TikTok ban. He now says he likes TikTok and wants to save TikTok, even though his own administration was looking to ban TikTok or force it to be sold away from a Chinese company. What is the risk of conflict now between the U.S. and China? Look, it's been significant over the past several years. Hard to quantify what that risk would be, but the specter of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan that could then trigger a war between the United States and China has been a growing one in Washington, in national security circles, as well as in our public debate. Trump himself has appointed a number of people who want to support Taiwan's defense, but has also suggested that Taiwan is very close to China, and therefore the implication would seem to be that it would be hard for the United States to successfully defend Taiwan, or it wouldn't make much sense. He has also accused Taiwan of not doing enough for its own defense and even of stealing our chips, quote unquote. So where will this end up? Very hard to say. It's possible that Trump could take steps that could reduce the risk of a U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan by issuing new assurances to China that are intended to strengthen the U.S. One China policy and give Beijing confidence in that. Beijing has complained over the past 4 years that the United States has been hollowing out, in its words, its One China policy. President Biden made 4 statements suggesting that the United States would definitely defend Taiwan if it were attacked by China, which is seems to contradict U.S. policy of maintaining ambiguity about what the United States would do in such a scenario. President Biden also suggested a few times that the issue of independence for Taiwan was up to the people of Taiwan, though he did come into line with U.S. policy after that by saying that the United States does not support Taiwan independence. Nevertheless, this is a complaint that China has, and Trump could at least test the proposition that if he were to make new assurances that reaffirm or even strengthen the One China policy, that make it clear that the United States does not want to see Taiwan permanently separate from mainland China, much less independent, could test the proposition that that might have an effect on Chinese behavior, and perhaps China would in turn issue an assurance of its own to use peaceful means in dealing with Taiwan, or it could reduce its military activities around the island. But that said, we could very much see Trump 2.0 building on Trump 1.0, as well as the Biden administration, to intensify U.S.-China competition, even if Trump attempted a more variegated policy in which he tried to reduce tensions over hot-button issues like Taiwan, while pressing on to do the trade war or to continue and tighten technology controls on China, it's very difficult to see U.S.-China relations becoming cooperative on the whole, no matter what the president might intend.
Time will tell. Let's leave it on that note. Stephen, thank you so much for joining Then and Now.
Well, thank you, Ben. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.